Hey, how you doing? Brian Cain, your peak performance coach here with a Monday message book breakdown on one of the best books I've ever read. It's called Above the Line by Ohio State's football coach, Urban Meyer. Now, what's the concept of above the line? Well, you see, Urban Meyer talks about how there's a line, and you're either above or you're below the line. Above the line behaviors are behaviors that are putting team first. They're behaviors that are intentional. While below the behind behaviors are behaviors that are putting the self first, or behaviors that are reactional instead of intentional. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that we're living above the line. And he gives a lot more examples in there of what's above the line and below the line behavior. And how I've used this with different teams is simply gone to a whiteboard, drawn a line across the board, and said, tell me in your program or in your office or in your life, if it's an individual activity, what's above the line and below the line behavior for you. Now I want to share with you 3 to Thrive, 3 simple concepts that will help you to better live above the line. Number 1, Urban Meyer talks about when he took over at Ohio State. He said we can have no BCD in our culture. And that stands for no blaming, no complaining, and no getting defensive. He says if we have a culture where no one's blaming each other, no one's complaining about the situation, no one gets defensive when they get coached, we're going to be able to be above the line and get some things done. He also talks about an acronym that I heard from Dr. Rob Gilbert years ago and also saw in Jack Canfield's book, The Success Principles. He says E plus R equals O. And it stands for event plus response equals outcome. Now, Urban Meyer refers to that as the R factor, and he says that anytime an event happens, and that's all life is a series of events. Anytime an event happens, you get to pick your R, you get to pick your response. And the bigger the event, the bigger your R must be if you want the big outcome. So we're always in control of our response. We're always able to choose how we respond to events. Ultimately, that will influence our outcome. So the third to thrive, after no BCD, after E plus R equals O, is understanding the 10-80-10 rule. He says, you see, in any program or any organization, any team, think about your team, there's 10%. 10% of the high achievers that are willing to do anything. They're all in. They're the models. They're the people that we want in our program. And then there's the 80% that kind of follow along and do what they're asked to do, but are never going to really go above and beyond. And then you got the 10% that we're just carrying, the 10% that are just hanging on, the 10% that are trying to pull us back. And he said what you've got to try to do is you've got to try to identify your top 10% and then try to move 5 to 10%, only 5 to 10% of that 80 into the top 10%, ultimately trying to eliminate that bottom 10%. And he shares a story about his great quarterback when he was the head football coach at the University of Florida, Tim Tebow, and how Tebow would come into his office every day and say, hey coach, let's go get an 80%er and bring him up to the top 10. And when you talk about a leader like Tim Tebow or a successful coach like Urban Meyer, my question for you is, where are you? Are you in that top 10%? Are you in just the average and middle 80? Or are you in that bottom 10%? And if you are in the top 10%, can you go get 1, maybe 2 other people to come up to that level with you? And if you're in that 80%, what can you do to be even more above the line and separate yourself from the rest of the pack and try to get into that top 10%? And if you're in the bottom 10%, I would suggest you to quit. Quit. And go find something you're going to be passionate about. Go find something you're going to be driven to do where you're going to be in that top 10%. Because if you want to be the best and you want to be your best, you've got to live above the line. You've got to be in that top 10%. You've got to choose your response in every situation, and you can't blame, complain, or get defensive. Be above the line. Check out this book. I think you'll love it, especially if you're a coach.